When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Gregg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to another episode of our podcast, Oldish, Conversations of Aging in the 21st Century. Gregg and I are very excited to have our good friend Leslie Ross-Degnan back again for another episode of our book club, looking at books that have themes related to oldishness. Today, we're looking at a book by the title of The Little Old Lady Who Broke All the Rules by Catharina Ingelman-Sunberg. Leslie Ross-Degnan bio is on our webpage. And Leslie, we're so happy to have you back today.
Thanks, Janet. I'm happy to be back. And the author of this book is Swedish. It was written in 2012 in Swedish and translated into English the following year in 2013. But this book has also been translated into lots of other languages: Italian, German, Spanish. And I'm not sure why, but in each translation, the title changes. And I just found that interesting when I was looking into her background. In Swedish, it's called Coffee and Robbery. In Italian, it's called You Cannot Trust the 80-Year-Olds. I like that one. In German, it's We've Only Started Now. I actually like that one. It's like a new lease on life, when you're old. I like that one. And the Spanish one is The Money or Your Life. So anyway, I just thought that was really fun. It was very popular, and she followed it up with sequels that became known as the League of Pensioners series. It's called that because this group of retired people call themselves the League of Pensioners. Here are the titles of the books that follow. They're equally, I don't want to say, I don't like really any of these titles, but they're equally interesting. So the first one, obviously, The Little Old Lady Who Broke All the Rules in 2012, and then The Little Old Lady Who Struck Lucky Again is number 2 in the series, written in 2014. And then the third one is A Little Old Lady Who Behaved Badly in 2017. I'm sorry to say I haven't read any of the other books. Have either of you read any of the follow-up books?
Not yet.
No?
Not yet. I'd like to.
Yeah, I would too, just to see how they continue. I got very attached to the characters. So let me tell you a little more about Catharina. Before becoming a writer, she was a marine biologist for 15 years. She was a kind of diving archaeologist, finding and exploring Viking ships. Pretty exciting life. She started her writing career with historical novels, and she actually won the Author of the Year in 1986 through her historical novels. For me, it was a little challenging to find a whole lot more information about her that was written in English. I don't know, Janet, if you found anything of interest in Swedish.
I did not,
you were in
unfortunately.
Sweden.
No.
Yeah, Janet has family in Sweden, and so she's been there a couple times, which I hope she jumps in later with some information from aspects of the book. So I just want to give you a brief synopsis without giving too much away of the story. This wasn't the greatest written or the best book I've ever read, but it was a lot of fun. And it really did touch on several aspects of being oldish. So just briefly, it's about a group of oldish people in Sweden who live in a retirement community rather contentedly until new management company comes in called Diamond House, and they begin to change things for the worse. And the staff and the residents thought so too. There were more rules, less food, certainly less good food, and most of which went to the staff. So our protagonist, Martha, she's a real feisty character. She gets fed up and starts to organize her friends to protest some of these changes. All of a sudden, there's no coffee hour and there's no cream buns with the coffee, and the residents are not happy about that. And they get into all sorts of hilarious hijinks around this, some of which does not work in their favor, most actually of which doesn't work in their favor. Well, Martha decides to raid the staff kitchen and cook a big meal with the staff wine until they're caught because they passed out from drinking too much wine. And so the new nurse Barbara, punishes them by locking them in their rooms. And this just fires Martha and her friends up more to find some ways to improve their situation and get back at the new staff and the new company. So they're trying to scheme some ways to improve their lot in the retirement home. When they're sitting around watching a documentary on TV about the Swedish prison system, and since Sweden is a socialist country, they have a pretty good system and pretty good social programs. So the Swedish prison system looks a lot better to them than life in their retirement home. So now Martha thinks, they have it a lot better than us. Look, they've got great food. They've got workshops. They're busy doing things. They get locked in their cells, but they still have lots of things to do. So they decided that they were going to commit a crime so that they can be sent to prison. And this is when the craziness really begins. Oh, that's a brief synopsis. But you want to add anything, Janet or Gregg?
That's great. And I wanted to add that Sweden is known for having really nice prisons. I think it's probably on a continuum of you are in prison and have to stay in a cell, but it does have a reputation for much nicer prisons than our country, for example.
There's an interesting statement in there, which is that you mentioned that Sweden we think of as a socialist country, and the prisons are run by the socialist government. But for some reason, the retirement home is a for-profit business, and it's starkly for-profit. Most of the problems with the retirement home are because the head nurse and the owner are trying to cut corners to increase profits. So there's a real clear statement of socialism versus capitalism, and the socialist system treats even prisoners better than the capitalist system treats regular people. So that's
a
the
great
extent
point.
of politics that I'm going to do today, because I don't want to get in any oldish politics arguments, but I was surprised that they were living in a retirement home that wasn't run by the government. So I don't know how common that is, but it was clear that because it was being run for profit, that was the source of all of the problems. That plus the romantic greed, I think, is the only way that I could put it for the nurse, who not only, the reason that she wanted to cut corners and make the things profitable is she thought that that would make the owner of the business fall in love with her, and so she could marry him. And so I think of that as kind of romantic capitalism. So that was altogether strange, that whole interaction. She reminded me of Nurse Ratched. The other people reminded me of the gang that couldn't shoot straight.
She may have taken a little bit of creative license in interpreting all of that. So I'm not really sure whether all the nursing homes are like this. But of course, she had to create a conflict, so that may have been.
Well, and
it's a good one.
It's interesting that you're saying that, Gregg, because it was a little while ago that I read the book. But I wonder if it could have been a socialist system, but that, let's say they got a certain amount of money to run the retirement home, and the nurse was thinking about if she cut corners, then they would have more of that money for themselves. So I wonder if,
Mhm.
I don't know, because I don't even remember what they said about it now, but I wonder if it was that it was kind of like, we have this amount of money and we're supposed to be putting this money into, coffee breaks and cinnamon buns and better meals. But if
Exercise.
we cut corners, then we would have more money.
Yeah,
Money,
no,
and
I think that's really true.
And the owner wanted more money because he wanted to have a chain of retirement homes, and he wanted to use the more money to finance that. And the nurse wanted the more money to finance her acquisition of the owner of the nursing home.
Okay.
Well, yeah, there was certainly some corruption going on there, because,
Yes, that's for
there
sure.
were comments by the residents that, they're using our money to, and keeping the exercise room for themselves and putting all this great food and wine in the staff room and not allowing us in the kitchen. And, so they were suddenly, with the new staff, cut out of all of that. Whereas before, I think there was more free flow, as I recall, rereading it. So, so definitely there was some corruption, but they were messing with the wrong group of seniors when they started to do this.
I just wanted to say that it's an interesting, when we talk more today about some of the themes in this book, that is one of the themes as far, however that worked politically or from a business perspective, that the theme was that these oldish elderly residents didn't have any power. And we know that can be true as we get older in this country, and apparently there too, it's probably somewhat, well, it's not universal, but anyway, in our, we certainly see that around us where the older you get or the more physically and mentally incompetent, the less say you have and the more likely it is to be mistreated in those ways.
Yes.
And like you're saying, Leslie, this group of people were like, we're not having this, we're going to figure out how to be happy.
Well, I just wanted to jump in here for a minute and talk about the characters because I think they're really interesting. I mean, as we said earlier, it's a character-driven novel and the characters are themselves kind of humorous. Of course, the main character is Martha. She's the protagonist with all the big ideas and she's the one that shakes everything up. And then her friend, Anna Greta, Greta comes from money and she seems to be the one that funds these projects. She and Martha are friends, or all four of them or five of them are friends. So she's also retired from working at a bank. So she understands banks. She's good with money. She's good with the computer and the internet. And so, she does a lot of behind the scenes sort of information searching, and she funds all of these ridiculous capers. And then there's Christina. I kind of think of Christina as the guilty conscience of the group, or the Jiminy Cricket, kind of person. She's the one who keeps them all from getting too outrageous because they always seem to be on the edge of being outrageous. And I think her ideas are a little more sound and sensible than the others. She often brings them back from the brink of disaster when things are falling through the cracks and they're trying to do some last minute problem solving. Christina is like the voice of reason. Then we have Rake. I thought that was an interesting name. And for a while, I could not figure out why this guy was called Rake. It turns out he's a retired gardener. So hence the word Rake. I mean, they could have called him Shovel or Spade or something that wouldn't have been nearly as interesting as Rake.
And also, and that Rake has kind of a double meaning. So we find out he's a gardener, but he also is rakish.
That's what I thought it meant, actually.
Yes.
Because he's very handsome and friendly and fit. He kind of serves as that handsome distraction and, and is someone, an innocent kind of eavesdropper, which he uses to his advantage when he's trying to get information about what they're trying to do. The other male character was called Brain, and it was pretty obvious why he was called Brain, because, Brain was this retired engineer, and he's definitely the brains of the operation. Not only that, he's a real Mr. Fix-It, or or Mr. Build It, and he can find out how to do something if he doesn't know how. He's the kind of guy that turns Martha's crazy ideas into reality. And they start out with this friendship, and that becomes mildly romantic. And then also, I think Rake and Christina, is it? Yeah, also have a romantic relationship. So I don't know how you guys feel about these characters, but I'd be happy to hear you jump in and give your opinion or your impressions.
One of the questions that was in my mind was, why are the men known by their nicknames and the women are known by their names? None of the women had a nickname. Most of the main male characters had nicknames, and I could tell you what the women's names were, but I could not tell you what the actual names of the men were, because right off the author introduced them and then immediately started using their nicknames. And I never did figure out, I've been thinking about this for a week or two now, never did really figure out why that happened. What was the device? What was the literary device behind that? That have a meaning or symbolism or something.
My feeling about that is it felt like a female book. In other words, it felt female driven. These men were involved and they were helpful and sometimes they were necessary, but it was Martha's thing and her best friend. And so it feels like their characters were more developed and even deserved a real name, because there was complexity to them, whereas maybe for the guys there wasn't as much. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, the women were all together too. I mean, in every circumstance, like at the retirement home, the women had their rooms and men had their rooms, and in the prison, the women were all kind of clumped together and then the men were all kind of clumped together. So there were definitely, gender roles going on there. The women were also kind of the brains of this, the story here, but they didn't, I thought that was interesting that he was called Brains and he was the brains in the situation. But then there was, there were 3-4 other very intelligent people that were making everything happen as well, behind the scenes. So, I mean, I didn't really get too concerned about the gender differences because, they were kind of all together as a group.
Yeah. And I think, the gender role, if we think about it, was kind of turned around, especially for I'd say the stereotypical expectation for elderly women is that they're quiet, they're reserved, they stay in their place, they don't make waves. And here's Martha. She's like, no, this doesn't work for me. And then she gathers everybody around and makes all these ultimately, goes on an adventure, makes all these changes.
Yeah, I think that's probably it. I'm thinking, well, a lot of the mystery or thriller kind of books that I've read have been the main characters are men, and I think in those books, fairly often the women are reduced to a role. There's a secretary, or there's the beautiful damsel in distress, or something, and they're often named by their role. So maybe this is just the author just said, I'm going to do the reverse of that. See how that feels, and going on from there. There was one other thing about the stuff. There was romance did happen, but partway through the book, when the romance started happening, it felt to me like the author realized that there were these 2 male main characters, and she paired them off with 2 of the 3 women, but that left one of the women out. So she threw in this random guy on a ferry. And he had a name, but he was only known by his first name. It was Gunner or something like that. And he would only show up in scenes where the 2 women and the 2 men who had paired off went off for a while. And there was it was Anna Greta, left to her own devices, pining for Gunnar. I thought that was interesting. I almost think that maybe she should have gone back to the beginning and put in three guys. But maybe three guys would have overwhelmed the dynamic for the crimes and stuff. And, Gunnar would have been the guy that insisted that everybody do it his way.
Well, maybe that's a good reason not to put three guys in there so that they didn't take over all that decision making.
Yeah.
But I sort of saw Anna Greta as comic relief because she was like in a way, kind of horsey. She painted her as like not terribly attractive, not someone that was likely to, have a late in life romance, that kind of thing, and then she kind of twisted it around at the end and created her, gave her a later in life romance. I felt like it was might have been a second thought of the writers to throw that in.
No,
but
I felt that way to me too. The romance between the other four characters, they paired off, so there was no mixed gender kinds of stuff. So they paired off in traditional things, and they would disappear into a room and reappear later smiling. So I think it was more than just friendly romancy kinds of stuff. I think there was more going on with that. It was never explicit. But I think that was part of the point that she was trying to make, is that not only are they're all pretty much octogenarians, right? So, so I think part of her point was not only are these people feisty enough to go rob the national treasures and get involved in all of these wacky schemes, but they're pretty sexy too. So that was good. It's one of the benefits of the book to me, is like that sex positive approach to the Oldish. And I don't know whether that's because it's Sweden or whether it's just her attitude toward that, or I'm actually fairly sure that it's real, but our American media culture, movies and so on, TV shows, you don't have a lot of that. I was happy about that part. It gave me some hope.
It's interesting because I didn't, that's what I love about talking about this together, is I was thinking so much about what the author did around age and oldishness. And I didn't think as much about all she did to refashion our thoughts about oldish women, and that oldish women can be sexy and sexual and can be leaders and can be dreamers and can be change agents. And, Leslie, as you're talking about the different characters' roles, and I found myself thinking, so Martha was like the leader, and like, as I was thinking, maybe the dreamer, like, we can do this, what happens if we do it this way? Christina was kind of, like you said, the guilty conscience, the Jiminy Cricket, and we need that. But that was a woman doing that with other women. And then Anna Greta, kind of like the solid, keep everybody grounded person.
Yeah. I think that, she did aside from just their basic personalities, I think she did, like Gregg said, she did create a wholeness. And I think she did this subtly too, by bringing their sexuality into the light, that, yeah, old people do have sex. And you're right. We don't show that in American, movies and media as much. So I appreciated that she did that too. But I think that she did do it in a subtle way. She didn't do it she wasn't sort of brash or about it. And so I think because older people are going to read this and they're going to say, yeah, great. You go, girl, Martha and Rick. Yeah, that was kind of an interesting part of the way she developed the characters and their relationships. I really enjoyed how she did that. I mean, what I liked about this book was the character-driven nature of the story and how all those relationships were forged among the group. that she added lots of relevant characters that move the story forward, aside from the main characters. But I think you're right about the three women being sort of the main characters. Yeah. But then there were other secondary characters like Dolores. She was an interesting character who, she's given that shopping cart full of money that her son, who works on the ferry, found. Yeah. And so she was an interesting secondary character, an important one around plot. And the other thing I liked about this story were the plot twists and the complications and the subplots. I thought those were done well. So those other characters like Petra, the maid from the Grand Hotel, I think she was, they hid the painting that they stole, and she innocently walks in and decides to redecorate. And they see the priceless paintings that they stole off the wall and sticks them in some storage cupboard, and then that just creates all kinds of complications, right? For the story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, one of you just mentioned like what drew you to this book or made it so enjoyable. And for me, especially in the context of this podcast, I felt like this book touched on so many themes that touch all of us potentially as we age and being oldish. And I thought Catharina did such a great job of weaving in these many themes. I'm just going to say a few and open it up for you to add. I thought one of the biggest themes was stimulation. That as we get older and we're not raising kids or working, maybe we've retired, and we're trying, some of the themes we've talked about in other episodes. What do you do in this stage of your life? And here were these characters in a retirement home, and maybe they were okay until the cost cutting started. But I would suggest that they weren't really okay. They were okay with maybe. They're okay with what was expected of them at this point, was to live in this retirement home, to have these meals, to have people that could sit around and watch TV, but that there was this parts of them that were not being stimulated, and that maybe they weren't even thinking about it that much. So they discovered the gym room, but then it was closed only for the staff. Why was that? So that's an example of, physical stimulation that once they started off on their adventures and were in the Grand Hotel and found out that they could go swimming and they could go to the spa, and they found out that they were walking lots of places and started to realize that they were stronger and enjoying their increased physical abilities.
Yeah, that was interesting. And that's a good theme, lack of stimulation. And I think that's part of what really got them going into some of the hijinks they got into. Some of the other attitudes that sort of helped them in their, their robberies, where the old people are invisible. That's a theme that I noticed, that we don't even look at them half the time. We pass them on the street. We don't stop. We don't look. We don't say hi. They're just shuffling along or whatever, But people of a certain age really become invisible and stupid even. We even think they're not very bright. I'm thinking about evidence in that in the story is how people don't notice them even when they steal paintings, from the National Museum. And the police are sitting there watching the camera footage. And they just completely disregard these old people with walkers. I just thought that was incredible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I felt like even when they went to the police themselves, because they wanted to get into the Swedish prisons, and they told them, we did this. And they're like, sure, you couldn't have done that. It's like, yes, this is how we did it. They went through, we did this, and then we did that. And then they're like, oh, that's really wild. That's one thing I just loved about this book, because I felt like it's so important. I think about Brains and how he was an engineer. And like you were just saying, Leslie, as he would be walking by, nobody would look at him and think, oh, maybe he did something really interesting when he was younger. Maybe he's really smart. Maybe I want to learn more about this. It would just become invisible.
Yeah, right. And when they're going around, scoping out all the ATMs in town, the police don't think, I wonder why these old people are what are they doing looking at all these ATMs? There's no suspicion, really, at all, because, they're underestimated. Their abilities and what they could do are grossly underestimated, that they could barely even use an ATM machine.
Exactly. So I just want to add to the list that I had for stimulation was the physical exercise, which I think also could be a part of the romantic piece that she brought in, just the sexual energy and experience, be able to be creative. They'd gotten into these grooves that was what was expected for them at a retirement home. And then they turned into just being incredibly creative, how to make these heists happen. Use the stimulation intellectually, which goes along with that. Stimulation foods, just be able to taste yummy foods, the stimulation of having a purpose. And I know that as a psychologist, I know that research has shown that the things that help people as they age include having a purpose, having a community, and being able to enjoy things in their life. So this book definitely brought up all of those.
Definitely did.
A couple of things come up for me in that, and that are related to that. For one thing, I just have to throw it in there, but because of who we are, is if this book had been written in 2023, they would have been playing pickleball, and they would have had their physical exercise and their blood flow improved by playing pickleball. But there was an aspect to that and she was explicit about it in a sense, in that she said because of the exercise, they started feeling randy again, which is a really good point. There was a little subtlety in that it wasn't shocking in their environment, where here, if you heard of 80-year-olds suddenly getting it on, it would be like, oh, that's icky, but perhaps because Sweden is more sex positive than the US is, well, of course they did. The first thing they did when they came home from jail was they paired up. Well, not the first thing, but pretty close. They paired off, and what they missed when they were in prison was each other. So
yeah.
So I think there's an important cultural difference there. In our culture, the culture doesn't tend to think positively of people who are 80 years old getting it on in the nursing home, although it's happening. But you see a headline every once in a while, but it's all like the headline is to make bank on the ick factor.
No, and I think she kind of brought the reader gradually along with developing those relationships that blossom from friendship into possible sexual relationships. I think that attests to the character-driven nature of the story, which I liked. And I liked the way she kept Martha and Brain connected in prison through these poems that they wrote back and forth to each other, and that were passed back and forth through I guess it must have been the church, the prison pastor or something, or priest or whatever. And I thought that was an interesting kind of device. She also left a lot of stuff out for a long time to create tension and brought characters in. I don't know, who were the guys that were part of the mafia? That was an interesting subplot. Although I don't know how much she needed that one, but it was still interesting. Do you remember that? Does anybody have thoughts about that?
Well, it gave them another caper. And it was interesting that they went from, they figured out that stealing the money from criminals that they had helped to steal that money in the first place somehow made stealing that money okay.
Right. That was Brain. because he met this guy in prison, right? The mafia guys. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, they had a lot of justification conversations around like what's okay and what's not okay, and where does all this money go, and who do we help with this money, right? And I think a lot of that came from, Christina, like the conscience of the group.
I was just in Sweden, and so I did a little tour for this book just to look at some of the main places that were talked about. So I saw the Grand Hotel, and it was definitely grand. It was very old and majestic. And then I saw the National Museum, which, just like in the book, was a stone's throw from the Grand Hotel. So in the book, when they're talking about looking out the window and looking at the National Museum, it actually is that close. And then I saw the Viking cruise and took a picture of that also. So we could put those on the website for people to see.
Oh my gosh, what fun.
It was so much fun. It was really fun. It was just really fun to have the book come to life in that way. I just wanted, before we run out of time, wondered if we wanted to talk about how we here might be like the League of Pensioners. Does that resonate for either of you? As it's just a question that popped into my head as I was getting ready for this podcast.
I don't really relate. I mean, I relate to the feistiness of being outspoken about, what's okay and what's not okay. As I grow older, I'm not in a retirement community or anything yet. So I didn't really relate to that aspect of their anger and frustration and some of the ways that they were treated, and in terms of being kind of helpless and older. I feel like it's different in America now. And hopefully this was written, like you mentioned, Gregg, in 2012. So I think things have changed, and which is probably the reason that you're doing this podcast, is to shed light on some of those changes. So yeah, so I didn't have that feeling.
I do, in that one of the reasons that we're doing the podcast is to reflect the changes, but also influence the changes a little bit, and that's happened a little bit. People have reported back to us that they've done something because they heard us talking about it. We reflect a lot of the notions of the increased creativity. What we're doing even today, talking about a book that somebody else wrote, this is a reflection of our own creativity as well, because we are creating how we're talking, so we're thinking about something and making something new out of it. So there's a modern form of expression. There's a thing about agency where we're taking control of this ourselves. Nobody came and said, hey, why don't you guys do a podcast? Or why don't you guys have a book club online? And, it's like, well, that'd be a good idea. Let's do that. There's kinds of behaviors that I think the League of Pensioners would do that would be somewhat surprising. The various institutions would be surprised to see us doing what we're doing. So, so there's that, and maybe we can get away with it because nobody expects us to do it. But it's not the same thing. I don't identify completely with any of the characters, but the notions and a lot of the themes certainly are reflected in our work, and the three of us getting together to talk about these different themes on a regular basis is a reflection of that. And we're not as old as the people in this book, but from our perspective, we're not. But from the perspective of somebody that's 30, we certainly are.
Well, yeah. And then I take that perspective and I look at people in the next, decade from me, further ahead. And I look at my father, who's 98 and is in assisted living. I see a lot of these things reflected in his life and his lack of, especially the lack of stimulation, like you mentioned, Janet, and the lack of independence, and the ability to, I think when you lose things like the ability to drive, then your world becomes smaller. That actually was reflected in this because, some of the residents didn't drive and they needed to hire a guy, the son of somebody for the getaway car, but they figured out how to do it. Yeah. So it's like the thing that it throws you into is creative thinking. Like, how do I get what I want and still live a rich life? So So yeah,
Yes.
you're right. Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. So I think, in conclusion, I really feel connected to the idea of the League of Pensioners. And I feel like they took on this mission. I think who they were evolved over time as far as even their own understanding and awareness of what was going on with them. But for us, as we have the whole book, ultimately that they represented what the best of what could be for people, oldish people, as we age. And I feel so passionately about being part of that change, a change agent.
Yes.
So I just felt very excited about the book and about being our own League of Pensioners and moving forward, as you were saying, Gregg, just the awareness, that there can be agency. And so as we come to the end of this episode, I want to heartily thank our good friend, Leslie Ross-Degnan, for joining us once more for a book review. This has been a very enjoyable conversation about the little old lady who broke all the rules. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Well, this was fun. I really enjoyed having this conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Leslie. It's been great visiting with you again, as always, and with you on the topic of the books, Janet. I'm really enjoying this.
We are looking forward already to our next book that we will review. And we invite you to put in our notes any book that you would like us to talk about.
So there's a way to comment on our website. Go to the website, www.oldish.me, and find this episode or any other episode that's there. There's a way for you to comment. And as always, we thank you for listening and sticking with us this far. We look forward to talking with you again soon. Thanks, Janet. As always, it's been great to hang out with you for a little while. We're looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Gregg. See you again soon.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We enjoyed our visit and hope you did too. Our next episode will be another in the Dinking Game series, in which we talk about an aspect of the game of pickleball and how it relates, or sometimes doesn't, to real life. In this episode, we'll talk about the transition zone and how to maintain your balance when you're caught off guard. You may know it as no man's land. It's where Pema Chodron refers to as groundlessness. We give a shout-out to Aaron McHugh, author of the bestseller Pickleball is Life. You can leave comments or requests for topics or guests on this or other episodes at www.oldish.me. There's a link there, too, if you've wondered how you can help support our podcast. There's also a link there to Amazon where you can buy the book, The Little Old Lady Who Broke All the Rules. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.